Okay guys, welcome back. Now we're going to look at setting up our player controller. So this is obviously how our player is going to interact with the environment. For this one we're going to look at setting up the basics of the prefab and just testing out the controls, make sure they work fine. So let's jump straight into that now. So what you need to do is we've got our little player test environment scene. If you've got another scene open up, just jump back into that one there so we can save it all in that one scene. Now we've got our ground and that's set to the walk on me layer. That's all ready to go. So we're going to come up here to the top menu where we've got Invector. Going to click that drop down and we're going to actually make a shooter controller. So we go down to the shooter menu and create shooter controller. Now this is going to bring up the wizard. Let's open it up off screen, so I'll bring that across here. So here it's asking that the FBX model needs to be set to humanoid. Can't really avoid that. When you do play around with the enemy models, you can actually set up a non-humanoid character or a generic character, but as far as the player is concerned, it'll need to be a humanoid character. So we're going to bring in the FBX model. I'm going to just click on that little circle. Obviously we've got nothing in the scene, but in our assets we've got a whole bunch of them because I've imported a whole lot of the pack. Now, here's the thing, you can bring in a placeholder model and have that set up. The problem is with the player controller for Invector, it's actually kind of hard to, once you set up all the other little bits and pieces on it, it's actually hard to bring across a new player mesh or a new player model to sit over the top of it. There are some ways where you can, rejig the skeleton and things like that, but it's actually easier if you already have your final player model or something similar to it. It's best to do it with that. But just be prepared that if you are going through a pipeline where you don't have the full art assets yet and you don't have your player character exactly the way you want it, you may need to completely rebuild from scratch your player model. But once you've already made it before, it's not that hard to continue on with what you've done. It's just a little bit time consuming because you have to go back over what you've already done. Anyway, I already have mine perfectly fine, so I'm going to go and look for the sorcerer character because that's the one that I normally use. I do quite like his outfit and he looks pretty groovy. So I'm going to choose that as my FBX, and as you can see now it's brought him into here. A little bit dark up my screen, but I think on YouTube it should be fine. And here's our groovy looking dude with a basic material that I'm probably going to change a little bit later on. Next we need to set up the animated controller. Again, we're going to click on the little circle to bring up what we've got. Now you can see here we've got a whole different list of ones that have come in from various asset packs, but what we're looking for is the Invector Shooter Melee version 2, because that one gives us both the mix of the shooter content and the melee content as well as the basic locomotion. So we're just going to double click that and that's going to assign that. Oh, so now he looks a lot brighter. I think just the lighting for the scene or whatever jumped around. Cool. Camera list data. Here's where you can sort of figure out what kind of game you want. If you're trying to make like a Diablo clone, maybe you want one of the top-down ones. It is actually a very different controller to make the top-down thing, and for this RPG, I'm actually just going to be having a regular over-the-shoulder third-person game. I'm not going to have the top-down controller. So I can do, in future, I might do one where I show you how to set up a top-down controller, and we might make a little game based off that. But for the purposes of this tutorial series, I'm just going to go with the standard one. So we're going to click on the circle again. We're going to look for, we've got a whole list, basic locomotion, shooter only. We want V, shooter, melee, combat. Camera state. So that one there, just double click that. And then of course the HUD controller is already built there. If you've already built your own HUD later on, you can drag and drop that one in there. But this is just the default one that comes with it. If you need to know any more about that, you've obviously got this link here to the video tutorial done by Invector themselves, and that explains a bit more about it. But now you can see we've got our little humanoid. He's doing his proper T-pose. If you're seeing faults in this thing here, then there's clearly a problem going on with your FBX model, and you'll need to check that out. But for now, this looks fine, so we're just going to click Create. And now you'll see at the 0 point in the scene, we've got our third-person shooter. Going to come down here. Here he is here. He's looking kind of happy. So what we're going to do, the first thing that I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to go to my game components, and I'm going to go to the player folder, open that, and I'm going to rename this. I'm going to press F2, and I'm going to call it Player, just so that we know what we're dealing with. And then I'm going to actually drag that down here to create a prefab. So now this prefab here is the same as this one in Scene. So just to tell you the difference between that, when it's in your project folder and you've got this little blue game object box here, you can drop it down and see anything that's underneath player. See, there's like a further one down here in the root or whatever, but you can't get to that from here. You can only see the top layer, or the first layer of children that sit under the top layer there. The one that's in the scene is known as an instance version, so we can make changes on here and it's not actually going to affect this one down here in the project folder unless we click this button here that says apply. And what that does is that gets all the data from that and then saves it into everything that's on here. So when you update something in here, if you want it to change across various scenes or if you want it to continue on, you need to click apply, and then that will save it to the prefab down here. So now that we've got that, we're actually going to leave the player one there. What I want to do with the new scene essentials is go to this folder, say in scene, and then new scene essentials. The reason I got this one here is so that I can pick out the bits and pieces that I need to throw on top of any scene that I open up in order to get running around with the player inside it. So when we have a look here, originally we had the ground, we had a directional light, and we had the main camera. Now the main camera with the wizard has turned into V third person camera. We're going to leave that named as that, that's perfectly fine. We could always change it to main camera again or whatever, doesn't really matter, but that's one of the prefabs that we're going to need to bring down into, sorry, one of the game objects that we're going to need to turn into a prefab. So we're going to click and we're going to drag that down into this thing here. So a new scene, we're definitely going to need a V third person camera. The next thing that come up was this aim canvas clone. So this here is for when you're using the shooter controller, you need an aim canvas that's going to pop up for that. So that's obviously something else that's popped up with the wizard. So we're definitely going to need a copy of that. So we're going to bring that down here, and then we're going to create a prefab of that. The player, we've already got the player prefab in the player section, so I don't want to save that as a second prefab because that means that whenever I'm making changes to it and I click apply, it's going to change this one in the new scene essentials and it's going to ignore this one in here. So we don't want to do that. We want to leave it there. We just need to know that every time we make a new scene, we'll need to go to the player and drag the player in there. One of the other things that's popped up is the V game controller. So we're going to need a prefab of that too. That one there just handles the player prefab and the spawn point so that when you die, it will wait a certain amount of time and then spawn your player back at that prefab. So that's something that's sort of, yeah, I mean, you don't superly need it, but it is there as one of the things that started up. So we're gonna make a prefab of that as well. That'll be handy for us in the future. Event system, that's another one that's popped up because obviously we're going to have a user interface and the event system controls some of that input. So we're going to drag that one down to the prefab, the new scene essentials file. And then of course we have the user display, so the heads up display on the UI. So we're going to leave that named VUI. It might look a little bit confusing when you're looking for it, but we'll leave that down there. We're also going to make that into a prefab. So now what happens is if we start a new scene, we can get these prefabs, drag them all into the scene, drop in a player, and he'll be able to run around on whatever you've got set up in your scene. So the first thing we're going to do before we actually try and test it, we're going to need to test a few things, but we need to go to our player and open up the third person controller properties. So the third person controller script, we need to click on open properties. We need to go to layers. And see here we've got ground layer, auto crouch layer, all that stop move layer. It's set to the default, so if we actually played it now, our character would fall through the scene. In fact, let's just try that and see what it does. See, now he's set here to falling, so he's not actually falling down through it because there is an object there is a collider on the object, so it is keeping him from moving in 3D space. If we try and move forward, we can, but we're sliding around. Now the reason he's in this little jump motion here or falling down motion is because the controller is trying to find the ground layer underneath him and it can't find it. It's shooting out a little raycast from the bottom and it's saying I can't find a ground layer within it doesn't have it written here, but it's in one of the other sections there. I can't find a ground layer within this distance, so therefore I must be falling through the sky. So it sets him to the falling animation, and we can still move around because he's still got the control on him to move him around. That's obviously not what we want to have happen, so I'm going to have to hit escape and then stop it playing. Now the reason for that is because if you remember, we set the ground to walk on me layer. So right now underneath him is not ground, default, it's walk on me. So we do ground layer, click on the little drop down menu, select walk on me and default. We can leave it to the default now, we can take it away a little bit later, but for now default. And of course if we click play now, he realizes that he's standing on something that he can walk on, so now we're going to start walking. Hooray, we're walking around, that's pretty cool. Now, as you can see, when I push forward on the keypad, he sort of slowly starts up and then he gets into his run, and he's sort of moving along. At the moment, he's set to, on the locomotion tab, he's set through here, just not using root motion, but using the standard animations that are basically, walking on the spot animations. So depending on your character, you'll have two versions of animations. You'll either have root motion or you'll have standing on the spot. I prefer to use the root motion. So that's the root motion animation, is where basically your animation itself has a 0 point that you start at, and when you start walking forward, the character model is actually moving forward in 3D space, as opposed to just going through a walk animation standing on the spot where the legs are moving but the rest of it isn't. So the difference there is that when you're using root motion, it's actually using the animation to propel your character forward. So your character will move in the direction that the animation moves. When you don't have it on, it's playing the animation, but then using the third-person controller script or the movement script in order to propel the rigid body forward. So your character's moving based on your code rather than based on the animation. I like root motion better because it usually tends to have a lot more fluid animation transitions. So I like to use root motion, but when we do that, we need to make sure that we set these other options down, because what's going on now is this controller, if we play it without changing any of those things, you can see our walk speed is set to 2, so we're sort of walking normally, and then if we run a little bit faster. If we sprint, we go faster than that. If we crouch down, we're going slower again. Now, what happens if I just tick root motion? What's actually happening is it's moving the character based on the animation, but then it's also increasing the speed we're going to be going by adding these numbers here to propel the rigid body forward. So you'll see as we go along, we're now walking at like quite a large amount of speed, and we're getting way away from our camera, what our camera's trying to do, and it's not liking it at all. So that's clearly not going to work. So what we need to do is we need to actually set these values to 1, or I think even 0 works actually, but I'm just going to set them to 1 now so that there's no real multiplier by which way they're going. They're all just going to go at the same speed that they're supposed to be going. We can also rotate by world, turn on the spot anim, roll control, I like having that, and turn on the spot. We'll flick those on. They're sort of other little bits and pieces that sort of affect the way we work. And now you can see we're sort of moving properly. Now, one of the good things here is that I like doing is that it actually looks a lot better too. Because we're on a white ground, you can't really tell. When you're playing the animation and propelling it forward without using root motion, you're actually, the feet are technically not making contact with the ground and staying in the thing. You could set your animation to super slow and your feet will sort of slowly move, but your character will go at a normal pace. So your feet will sort of float above the ground and it just doesn't look right. Whereas when you're using root motion, it's every step they're taking is that actual distance away that the foot is from the other foot. So as you can see, as we're stepping here, so if I had like a blue spot in front of me and my right foot was on that blue spot, as I'm moving forward and my right foot's going back, that blue spot is exactly where my foot is on the terrain. So yeah, I don't know if I explained that really well to you, but if you get what I'm going, then good. If you don't, we'll showcase it later when we actually have some textures on the ground. But for now, we've got our guy and he's running around. He can roll, he can jump, he can crouch, and he can also go to a strafing motion like this, and that's all fine, and he's doing it at the right speed, and he's using root motion. So we know now that that works, and that works fine. So let's just, before we get into some of the other stuff, I can see one issue here that we've got. This is our Capsule Collider for our character. As we can see, the bottom aligns, pretty much on the 0 point with the foot. I think the feet sit just a little bit below him. That's all right. But if we have a look here, we can see that the top of the Capsule Collider stops there, and it needs to pop up a little bit further. So this is our Capsule Collider here that we're talking about. I'm just going to click on Edit Collider and just drag it up so it looks like it's touching the top of his head. Yeah, I like that a bit better. I think that that works well, because I think what will happen is if you have the auto crouch layer on and your Capsule Collider's here, your head's going to clip through things and it won't realise that you need to duck. So you need to pop it to the top of your thing so that it all aligns correctly. Alright, so that's the first part. So we're going to click that. We're going to click Apply as well to apply that to our player prefabs. And now when we come down here, if we open up the input, sorry, third person controller, we go to layers, and you can see we've edited the prefab there. Alright, so back onto the instance of the player. Now the next thing that we need to do is, if we just minimize all of this, you can see we've got a whole bunch of these things. We need to start putting on the different components onto our player model. So in order to do that, we've got to go to basic locomotion. Now I know that we're making a shooter, but basic locomotion has a bunch of the components that we're going to need on them. Culling fade, I'm not going to worry about too much just yet. We can chuck that on a bit later. I don't normally use it. What we do need to do though is we need to put on a ragdoll, because we're going to use our ragdoll physics for when we get blown back by things and that in the future. So this is always best to be the first thing that you put on after creating the player prefab, or sorry, creating the player through the wizard. You need to put on the ragdoll first, because what will happen is the ragdoll is actually going to read the player model and figure out where it needs to put the arms and stuff. So if you start putting on some of these other things, it's going to start putting on colliders, and that may affect the way the ragdoll reads the model. So we just do ragdoll first. It's going to bring up a little create ragdoll screen, and as you can see, it's already auto-filled based on a human prototype. The animator that it needs to read from is the player. Generic character template, don't worry about that one there. We don't need to worry about that. Total mass, set to 1 proportional mass is true. Total mass, we can set that up now. You know what, I'm going to make that 40. Don't worry about needing to flip forwards or the projection proportional mass. So as you can see here, we've got the root bone is going to be the hips, and then we've got the left legs, left knee, ankle, all that sort of lines up with where it's supposed to be. Now we're going to click create, and now you can see we've got our little ragdoll model here. It's based on what we need to get. So you can see the arms have got its own little ragdolls, as they sort of move around. The hand is actually included in that one there. And then we've got 2 on the torso. We've got 1 on the head, which seems a little bit small. We might be able to increase that a little bit later just to make it a bit more bobbleheady. And then we've also got 2 for the legs as well. So this usually comes in after death when you've got like a body on the ground, you run into it and it sort of bobbles around and can look quite funny, especially when you're running into enemies and stuff like that. I do like it. But also when you've got things like explosion effects, it can knock the player back and turn on the ragdoll to make them sort of ragdoll a bit. And then when they get composed again, they'll pull themselves together, or we'll switch off the ragdoll and it will turn back into the regular animation. So anyway, so we've got that on our player now. We can open up the properties here. As you can see, it's got a bunch of things. You've got collision audio, you've got collision clip, so you can actually play a sound when things collide with it. The ignore tags are set to weapon and ignore ragdoll. They'll come into play a little bit later, and that is something that we need to actually, you know what, I'm going to get into that now. Now this is actually specific to the Cinti model, but your player models might also have something similar. So when we come down here, we can actually see that we've got several different things. So we've got a spell book here, and that's located on the player layer. So what's actually going to happen is that's going to be affected by the ragdoll, and its transform is going to be knocked around when the hips get knocked around. And I found that sometimes when the ragdoll goes on and then back off, these things can all be skew-if. So what we need to do is we need to make sure that this doesn't get affected by the ragdoll, and we do that by clicking on tag and setting it to ignore ragdoll, because it's just a picture, an aesthetic option. It's not actually, going to do anything in our game. It's not an object. It's just there to look pretty on the character. Now we've got a few more pieces like that are actually, we've got the sword holder, shield. Actually, I think on this guy here, there aren't any more character items that need to be affected, so that's fine. The only other thing you need to be aware of, especially with the Cinti models themselves, is when we go to the head, it's got eyebrows and eyes. And I've had some pretty funny tests where I've gone to a ragdoll state and then come back, and the eyebrows and eyes are like a Picasso painting over the face. So we need to make sure that they're also set to ignore ragdoll, and then they'll remain where they're supposed to be on the player's head. So that's just a little tip as well. If you've got characters that do have those little non-bone connected, but still, connected in 3D space to the character's hips or the root of the character, you need to affect that. It's not going to affect these ones in here, because these are just the skin mesh renderer for all the things, so they're fine. Anyway, back to the player. So the next thing that we need to look at now is setting up in the basic locomotion and the components. The next thing I like to put on is the footstep, because that's going to create colliders at the bottom of our feet. And as you can see here, they're sort of placed at the bottom. Yeah, we want to do that after we've done the ragdoll, because again, it's colliders on the feet and colliders on the ragdoll is going to get you issues. This version of Invector, it actually already comes set up with the default surface. Now if I click play and we run around, actually you won't be able to hear that because I don't have the game's stuff set up, so give me one moment. Oops. I'm just going to add that in now. Audio output capture, I'm going to unmute that. Now we're going to play it. There you go, now you've heard the footsteps. So as we're stepping, you can see it's creating a little audio source clone there for each foot. As each foot hits, it's playing one of the few sounds that are connected to the footstep sound. So that's all working fine, that's great. I'm going to turn that off. Now the next thing we need to add onto the player, again in basic locomotion, we want to add in the hit damage particle. You can use moveset speed if you're using a special set of animations. I'm not, and not for this setup, so I'm going to skip over that. If you do need to learn more about it, I suggest having a look at some of the Invector tutorials that cover the moveset speed, and hitting people up on the forums if you're having some trouble with that. But for me, the next one I'm going to put in the system is the hit damage particle. So let's just have a look at that. We're going to open the properties. So what it does now is here it's got the script. So whenever you get hit, you are going to play a little blood splash. So basically wherever you get hit on the body, it's going to spawn a little particle effect, which is this one here. And yeah, you won't see it unless I bring it into the scene. And then we watch. So it's going to do that. I'm going to delete that from the scene as well. It's going to spawn that whenever you get hit, depending on where you get hit. Now later on what we can do is we can actually set up some custom damage effects. So say if you get hit with a sword you want blood splash, but if you get hit with magic you don't really want blood popping out. You might want like a puff of smoke or something else to symbolise the different attack that you're getting hit with. So you can actually set that up in here by going one. It's going to set up an element and then it'll say damage type, and that will be basically the attack name in the other controller. So the enemy's controller that's hitting you will have an attack name, and you can set up that name there. So it goes, oh, damage type, you wanted poison gas. It will then play this other effect that you've selected and rotate to hit direction, attach in the receiver, that sort of thing. So you can set up a couple of little options there to make it fit more and look a little bit more real as it hits. We're not going to use that right now, but that will be something we look at later on when we start doing a little bit of polish on our game. But as long as we have it there, that means that it's there and ready to go. We go back to basic component. We've already got a head track, we've already got the rest of those, so that's all done. The next thing we want is the generic action. We want this script, it's going to be blank, but what it will do is it will allow us to trigger certain things. So when we go up to a door, or when we go up to a chair, or we go up to a lever, we'll be able to call on this script to basically affect that animation that it needs to do, or that action. And then again, generic animation, I don't think we need to do that one. I think that is for something else, is it? Oh, okay, yeah, so this one here we can use to trigger a simple animation. So we can have like an emote thing and you press G and he'll wave to everyone like that. Not really a massive thing that we need, but you know what, I'm just going to leave it there anyway just in case we want to play around with it later. And then the last one we need is the ladder action. So that needs to be put on our character so that it's already set up exactly as it needs to be. You don't really need to do any major stuff to it. But if we put a ladder in our scene, our character will now be able to climb up that ladder, whereas before it wouldn't have the ability to do that. So now we've got that, that's fine. Next thing we need to do is we need to go to the melee combat section. We need to go to components. We're not going to create a melee controller, we just need to go to the components. And the first thing we need to put on is the melee manager. So now, as you can see, it's put in some hitboxes on our arms. They look pretty good where they are. It doesn't have to sit directly over the hand, because what happens is when you punch, that hitbox actually flies forward a little bit and covers over in the animation sequence for the punching and the kicking that they've got. So while on the kick, it sort of covers towards the bottom of the foot. Doesn't necessarily have to sit on the bottom of the hands. If you are having problems where it doesn't seem to really be connecting properly, you can increase the size of it. But just be aware that increasing the size means that it can probably fly out and hit someone else along the way. So we've got that now, and you can select the different body members that are already there. You can add an extra body member, so in the case of people that want to try and do zombies or headbutts, things like that, you can make this head here have its own hitbox and have an attack where the head launches forward and hits something. you can do stuff like that. And then the weapons, we're obviously going to leave those blank because we don't need to fill them. They'll be filled automatically in the game when we equip a weapon. The next thing that you need to look at is who you can hit, and we've got the hit properties. You need the hit damage tags. So as you can see, right now we can hit one layer, and it's called enemy. So we can only pass damage to the enemy layer, nothing else that we touch. So if we punch a wall in default, it's not going to try and pass damage to it because it's not the enemy layer. So that is fine for on our player. Use recoil, so if we do hit something that isn't that layer, it's going to give us a recoil effect, like we'll punch a wall and go ouch and pull back from it. And then we can also draw the gizmos as we're punching it so we can see what kind of effects that is doing, but we're not going to worry about that too much. And again, the hit recoil layer, so we've already set that as the default. We can set it to something else if we want it to trigger off hitting any other part, like the stop move, that sort of stuff. But yeah, we don't have to worry too much about that now as long as we've got that on it. The next part is having a weapon holder manager, player only, obviously. So we click on that, and that's going to give us the ability to put in some placeholders on the system here, so we can have like a sheath for the sword, so that when you pick up the sword, you actually put it in the sheath at the back, and it stays on your character as a 3D mesh, so you can see it. And that just, you don't necessarily have to have that. If you want to have the weapons or whatever disappear into like the bag of holding, then that's how you can go. But if you do want it to sort of stay on your character so your player can see what weapon they have, you know, equipped in their secondary slot, things like that, that's what you want to do. So we just want to add that on there. We don't want to do anything with it just yet. Now we've already got that part done, so that's fine. So now we need to go across to the shooter section. We need to add the shooter components, and we want lock on player shooter only. You don't necessarily have to have this. I'm going to add it in my game because I want it to sort of be a bit fun and a bit fast paced. So if you need to lock on to a target to shoot it better, it doesn't really matter. Or like when you're doing the melee combat, it usually is a bit more handy to lock on to the target, and then you can unlock. So again, depending on what you want it to lock onto, this one here is just set to enemy. And obstacle layers are default, so if it hits into something, it's not going to lock on when you try and hit the lock on target button. Don't worry about too much of that. We'll go on about that. We'll go on a bit further about that later on. Just as long as it's on our model, that's fine. Now the next stuff we need to set up. So again, there's a lot that we've got to set up on the prefab, but as we go here, we need to go down to the inventory because we want our character to be able to pick up items and store them in an inventory and then select them at a later date. You might want a game where you don't actually use an inventory. It's just I pick up this sword and it's in my hand and I drop whatever else I was holding in that hand. But because we're going to be using the quest add-on, we're going to be carrying things like keys and special quest items and stuff like that. So we need to store that in our character's inventory. So to do that, we go down to the inventory menu, click Item Manager Player Only. Now it's going to bring up this separate window here. So we need to go to the inventory prefab. So to do that, what we're going to do is we're going to type in inventory, then I'm going to do _shoot, and as you can see now it's listed a couple over here. We've got shooter, shooter mobile, and shooter melee. Now of course we're using the shooter melee section. The quest inventory shooter, I can't remember whether I need to put that one on. Don't think I need to put that one on here, so I'm just going to go with the basic one now for setting up a basic shooter character. And I'll change it when we start getting into the quest stuff. So right now, inventory shooter melee is the one we need. I'm not going to click on the circle to do that, because what happens is when you click on the circle, it's going to bring up another thing, and it will actually deselect the player that you've got. So I just want to do it straight from there, and then just click and drag that all the way up to that. Now the item list data, we can click on that. We're going to click on it, and it's going to bring up these 4 ones that we've got here. Okay, so as you can see here, this one here is from the RPG pack, and this one here is from the plain one. We're just going to go with the plain one for now. We'll switch it over to the RPG pack a little bit later. So I'm going to click on that, and as long as we've still got the player highlighted, if I click off it, you'll see when I come here, please select the player to add this component. So I'm going to make sure that that's highlighted. Come back to this window, click on the window to refresh it, and it will come up here with create. Click on that, and now if we scroll down, we've got our item manager. So as you can see now, we can set that up and we can put everything on the character. Items filter, so right now we can only add consumables, so things like potions. We want to set that to maybe 5, I think. So we got consumable, we want to change it melee weapon, shooter, ammo, archery, and currency, because we've got another one. So I'm going to go 6. and currency, because that's going to be required for the quest system. So we'll leave that as that for now, and when we go add item, we've got a whole bunch of stuff that we can choose from. So we've got keycard, rifle shooter edition, cool, I like that one. And we should have the bow, V-bow, all that sort of stuff that we can add to it. Not going to do that just yet. Oops, excuse me. So I'm just going to click cancel on that, and that should be it for our character. Now I'm going to click apply, and what we're going to do now is we're going to come into the game. Just going to click play, and I just want to test to make sure that my melee controls are working fine as well. So I'm just going to punch, 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 kick. Yep, cool. Everything's working fine. Now, what we're not doing is we're not passing damage to anything because there's nothing for us to actually attack at the moment. Now, one thing I forgot to do in the scene setup for the other, or the project setup, was actually change the color space. So I'm going to do that now. First off, I'm going to just make sure that I've applied that there. I'm going to go File, Save the Scene, so that now it's saved to our Scenes folder under Player Test Environment. That's fine. I want to go to the Edit menu, and I want to go to Project Settings. I'm going to go to Player, and this will be our player settings. So we've already got that set up as all this sort of stuff. Now see here, color space is set to gamma. I don't like gamma. Everything looks better in linear, and most of the art assets that you might download will be like, yeah, set the color space to linear. So we're going to click that. Normally you want to do it before you start building up a big scene, because it's going to, see here's determining assets that need to be re-imported for target platform. I find that if you don't really have a scene full of anything at all in your project, it doesn't take too long to re-import. But depending on what kind of art assets you have, it might take a while to rebuild it. And I'm just going to go here, check the console. Yeah, there was just a random error, that's fine. Hasn't done any real damage. And then we want to go to directional light and see our soft shadows. If we go strength, that's fine. And the bias, we're going to drop that down to 0. Ooh, we're going to leave that one up a little bit. New plane, let's look at that. Colour, actually like having the white colour on there rather than a tinted colour. Yeah, we're just going to see how that works. Yeah, that's looking alright there. A little bit better. So anyway, so that's what we just want to do when we're playing around with a little bit of the lighting function, and that later you want to have the linear color space. So I'm going to save project now and do that. Alright, so the next thing we want to do in our player test environment, just to test that the stuff that we put on already is working correctly, going to go and look for the punching bag. So I'm going to type in punch, and as you can see here we've got a prefab for the punching bag. And it comes up, and that's everything there. That is the prefab. So we want to place that in our scene somewhere. I'm going to click on here and go to ISO mode because it looks pretty cool. And then we're going to drag that into a spot here. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to maximize on play when I do that because it looks a lot better. I'm going to turn off the stats so you can't see how good my 1080 Ti is not actually handling the scene at the moment. Should be down to 60 frames. I should get a lot better frames than that. As you can see now, we've got the nice little full screen thing, and we've got this punching bag. When we punch and we kick, we are passing damage, so we can lock onto that and strafe around it. Ooh, I'm going to punch you. I'm going to punch you. Pow, pow, pow. Alright, so there we go. We've done it. Excellent. And let me just look a bit off. Bounce. And if I roll into it, bonk. So yeah, he waves around. And then we know that we're definitely passing with those punches. You can see the numbers popping up on the screen there, so we are definitely passing damage with those hitboxes the way they were, and that's great. So that means that our character, in the most basic sense, with all the little things added onto him, is working fine for a basic controller. So that is how to set up our player controller for now. Again, I'm just going to make sure I apply because I don't remember not applying, so we'll do that. Yeah, that's how to get it working. Alright, so in the next episode we're going to look at a little bit more about the player controller, and we're going to start setting up some of the weapon placement on the controller itself. Thanks for watching. I'll catch you in the next episode.